We'll return to the gospel reading in a moment, but David also asked me just to say a few words about who I am and what VST is as well. So we'll do that, and then we'll come to the main event, which is thinking about the gospel for this morning. So as David said earlier, my name's Rob, and I'm the Professor of Anglican Studies and Formation at the Vancouver School of Theology. Also this morning, Jean is here, my wife, just waving now, and you'll tell from my accent, and when you talk to her later from her accent, that we're not from round here originally. We're both English, and we've been here just over kind of 18 months or so fairly new to Canada. And we came because of the job at VST. Before coming here, I was the Canon Chancellor at Wells Cathedral. I have to spell it because often people think I've said Wales, but it's Wells, W-E-L-L-S, in Somerset on the south coast of England. So that's where we were before coming here. And now I find myself at VST, and of course this morning we have not just one VST professor in the room, but actually two, because I've seen at the back of church there's also Richard Leggett, who's the Professor Emeritus of Liturgical Studies at VST, so you can also talk to Richard about anything to do with VST. He's also in a dog collar, so he's fairly obvious this morning. Good to see you here, Richard. So my role at VST is basically my primary role anyway, is to cajole Anglican students and also Episcopalian students into being Anglican or Episcopalian enough so that at the end of their degree they can be ordained and go out into parishes and serve the church. And that really is the bread and butter of what VST does. We train people to be ministers in churches. So we have several different denominations at VST, three primary ones, the Anglicans and Episcopalians, the Presbyterian Church, and the United Church. And VST is a conglomerate between the three. Principally Anglicans and United, and the Presbyterians are technically an affiliate member, but basically it's a three-way denominational school, which has all sorts of advantages and occasional surprises for everybody, because just occasionally we'll assume that other denominations are doing something exactly how we are, and suddenly we find that's not the case, even though it was a surprise to us. But there's a real richness in being able to do as much as we can together. And there are three of us at VST who have particular responsibility for one of those three denominations. There's myself for the Anglicans, Rebecca, who's the Presbyterian person, and Hyuk Cho, who does the United Church. My own research is mainly at the moment around New Testament studies, but I'm also really interested in retelling the Bible for children, and I have a book of children's stories coming out in the summer, and that's become a real interest of mine, how to retell the Bible in storytelling sort of fun ways for children, and actually I found adults quite like it as well. But I teach some New Testament as well as Anglican studies, and I moonlight as a Reformation history person as well, so I teach a little bit of that. But the good news for VST and for people who live near VST more generally is that anyone can come and do a certain number of VST courses. So I'd encourage everybody who lives within striking distance of VST to have a look on the website and see which courses might interest you. Anything at basic level is usually available for people to come along and audit if you want to, so you can come along and do it without doing all of the hard work for credit, but you're welcome to do that. The other thing that we have, which is of particular interest to people, is the summer school. So for 2 weeks in July, there are intensive courses. They're normally a morning or an afternoon for a week, so you could do up to 4 in a session if you really wanted to, but there's often courses there that might appeal to people, so do have a look at our summer school program. It'll be published in the next few weeks. As well as ministerial training degrees, the MDiv, we also offer Master of Theological Studies degrees and various other programs, and details of the programs and and some interesting swag, as well as a few bags and some notepads and things. That's all through where we're going to have coffee, and I'll be standing near the table where everything is, and you're welcome to come and talk to me about VST if you wish to. The other thing David invited me to say also, of course, is VST tries to keep its fees as low as possible for students, and one of the ways we do that is from donations from people. And so if anybody does wish to give any finance to VST, you're of course most welcome to do so, and I'll be able to tell you how you can do that. Or I don't know, maybe David would like to think about that as a church, and we'll do that. We'll do it that way. Okay. See David if you wish to give a donation to VST, and we'll see if we can get something together. Let's do the main event, which is, of course, thinking about the gospel. Will you pray with me? Lord, take the words of my mouth and the thoughts of all our hearts and use them in your service. Amen. Mark 1, 21 to 28, a short reading that we heard this morning as our gospel reading. There's a couple of words, though, that come up twice in that short reading. The words authority and amazed both appear twice. Jesus is teaching in the synagogue, and the people are amazed at his teaching. The amazement comes from the way in which he taught, because the gospel tells us that he taught as one having authority, which is evidently different from how teachings were usually delivered, because the people were amazed. Then Jesus casts out an evil spirit, and again the people look on amazed and declare once again that here is a new teaching with authority. This passage is set within the context of Jesus' teaching, and yet we never, in this morning's reading, hear the content of that teaching. Now, I'm sure that the content would have been fascinating to us, but the fact that Mark does not even give us one word of it is probably intentional. Our attention is not given this morning to the words of that teaching, but to the fact that it is Jesus who is teaching with authority, which amazes people. Maybe even those who were taught that day by Jesus remembered less of the words and more of the person. And that's because, in a Christian understanding, the ultimate content of the teaching is Jesus himself. In the words of Jesus that we do have recorded elsewhere in the Gospels for us, there are many good pieces of advice, many thoughts that will deepen our walk with God, many points to guide our ethics, and so on. But all of Jesus' words are a facet of the overall teaching, unified and complete in the person of Jesus. Now, we were not there in the synagogue that day, so there's always going to be a little bit of guesswork as to what went on. But I would guess that the reason the people ascribed authority to Jesus before he'd even undertaken the healing was that he was totally at one with the words that he was saying. He was obviously a living example of whatever teachings he was giving. The teachings flowed from him. An unfavorable comparison is made with the scribes and the Pharisees. They taught the law, the Hebrew scriptures. We often hear scribes and Pharisees and assume that they must be the baddies of the story. But in truth, of course, like people of all ages, most of them were just trying to muddle along as best as they could. There were some who were probably especially good, and there were some bad ones too. The two groups, the scribes and the Pharisees, had slightly different emphasis and interpretations from one another. But for them, no matter what their interpretation, There was always a distance between themselves and the teachings. They could not fully live out what they taught. And of course, that inevitably means that sometimes they were hypocritical, and hence unfavourable citations in the New Testament. But all human beings, and I dare say all of us, are hypocritical from time to time. And we should probably think about our own lives and what we say and do before judging the scribes and the Pharisees too harshly. But with Jesus, the crowd perceive something different. He was not teaching them an ideal while sitting at some distance from it. He actually lived what he taught. And as he speaks, his teachings are flowing from a deep place within him. He is embodying what he's teaching, or to put it the other way around, his teachings are flowing from his embodiment. The people in the synagogue would not have known it, although maybe some of them intuited it. But here in their synagogue was God incarnate, God truly embodied. And so it is the most natural thing in the world to see that what Jesus says flows from who he is, and that his words are fully integrated into his being. There's no gap between words and being. There inevitably was a gap for the scribes and the Pharisees. There inevitably is a gap for us. But imagine for a moment being in the presence of one for whom there is no gap between words and being. That really is authority. There are a few teachers who come close to that, and we tend to remember those as saints. St. Francis of Assisi is one such person. He so closely embodied his own teachings that he had an authority by simply living the way that he lived. But one of the reasons that we remember him as a saint is that he was also aware of his own failings. He didn't let his authority and his status go to his head. Perhaps in the modern era, we might think of someone like Mother Teresa of Calcutta. Some criticism has been levelled against her work, but in the most part, that's allegations from a militant atheist who seemed to object to Mother Teresa being religious, and in part other allegations from a Western doctor who said that the healthcare the sisters offered was not quite as good as it could have been. So the criticism seemed to be maybe overblown. No doubt healthcare could have been better if they'd been in New York and had had hundreds of millions to spend on healthcare. But Mother Teresa is another person to whom many have looked as someone who had authority just because of the way that she lived. And for saints, there is a great alignment between what they say and how they live. I always think that one of the reasons saints are only called saints after their death is that it's important to look at the sum total of a life before deciding. We can all think of various fallen idols. There are people in public life who talk a good talk and even live exactly in line with that talk for many years, but then do something so radically opposed to their own teachings that their authority is entirely undercut. I'm not going to name any names, but you can think, I'm sure, of many examples for yourselves. There is something in all of this that is helpful as we try to live out our own faith. Even the very greatest of the saints do not teach with the same level of authority as is seen in Jesus. And yet in their lives we catch a glimpse of what it is to live with at least a very minimal gap between teaching and belief and what one actually does. It is possible for all of us to keep working at minimizing that gap And that's a key part of how we are formed as Christians, minimizing that gap between what we say and what we believe and how we actually act in the world. We have to be aware that we are not Jesus. We are not saving the world. And so there will always be a gap for us. And of course, that means at some level, just like the scribes and the Pharisees, we do live with a certain amount of hypocrisy in our lives, for we will never perfectly follow what we teach, preach, or believe. But take comfort, because St. Paul knew this too when he wrote of the good that he sees that he could do, but never quite manages to achieve, and the bad he sees kind of welling up in him. We're in really good company with those who struggle to minimize that gap and sometimes don't quite achieve it. And yet, with Paul and Christians down the ages, we can gradually work away at decreasing that gap between our theory and our practice. It is to be hoped that for all of us, for most of the time, people will be able to look at our lives and wonder about what it is that we've got. It is in walking the walk that we can bless the world. And when our walking of the walk aligns with our talking of the talk, then we are close to our Master's way. And the world looks on us as having at least a measure of authority. And maybe, just maybe, they will even be amazed at what they see. We, you and I, are fallible. We stumble, we make mistakes, and so we come back to Jesus, ask forgiveness, get up again, and go on doing our best to walk in his ways as he would have us walk, both for ourselves, for one another, and for the world. Amen.